Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the Russian Revolution Part 2 by Oversimplified. Last time we got more of a general introduction to Russian history, saw the revolution of 1905, and ended with the beginning of World War I. Today we'll be seeing the Russian Revolution itself, so this is bound to be a fascinating one. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. Part 2.
While Nicholas had been busy playing with his new best friend, tensions in Europe had been rising. It just so happened that in 1914, one Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary went for a drive with the top down in Sarajevo. One thing leads to another, and suddenly Russia found itself at war with half of Europe. A wave of patriotism swept through Russia. The capital was renamed to Petrograd because St. Petersburg sounded a bit too German. Even revolutionaries were getting on board. To them, World War I was a big stinky imperialist war, but they didn't want their big stinky imperialist replaced by a foreign one.
Right.
So pretty much everyone wanted Russia to win. I hope Russia loses. Geez, read the room, Lenin.
Yeah, so Lenin was sort of unique here, right? So you can look throughout Europe at the beginning of World War I. You had a lot of socialist or social democratic parties that usually were very oppositional to their home governments. However, at the beginning of the war, most of them agreed to sort of quiet down for a little bit, stop with being oppositional, and support their governments through the war effort. Of course, this did not last till the end of the war, right? The war became very unpopular, but at the beginning, this was the case. You can look at, for example, Germany, the German Social Democratic Party. There was a debate within the party. Some of the more radical members, like Lenin, they did not want to support the war. But the more numerous members, the more moderate members, they said, you know what, we'll support our government, right? There was a bit of nationalism there. There was also an idea, and you could say this is sort of cope, more justification, but the Germans told themselves, well, sure, we don't love Germany, but we can't let Russia win. They're the worst imperialist capitalist power. The Russian socialists, they told themselves, well, we may not like the Russian Tsar's government, but we can't let Germany win. They're the worst imperialist capitalist power, right? So there was some of this sort of justification going on both sides of the conflict. But, like I said, you had the occasional, more radical socialist or communist who did not support the war effort from the beginning, and Lenin was one of those. Now, that may have sort of alienated him from some of his comrades early on, but as you can imagine, as the war became more and more unpopular, people started saying, you know what? Lenin's actually right about this.
Lenin hoped Russia would lose because that would help him overthrow the Tsar. As long as he did that, who cares if Germany blows up half the country? And blow up half the country, they did. An inefficient Tsarist government meant there were shortages of just about everything you need to fight a war. And if losing a teensy-weensy war with Japan upset the people, losing a giant war like this was much worse.
Right, and to be fair, you can see throughout Europe, people tended to be pretty unhappy with the state of the war. As you got years into the conflict, most of these soldiers were really angry at their own governments. But Russia was particularly bad, right? They suffered a lot of casualties. Not to mention, we saw last time, the Russian government was already not too popular. They'd gone through a revolution in 1905. They were facing a lot of political instability, so they were already on shakier footing than a lot of the other powers involved. And so, them getting more unpopular, well, they were already starting at a pretty low point.
Soldiers were deserting, the economy was imploding, and in no time, Russia was starving. The peasants were getting more peasanty, the workers were getting more workery, all the while Germany was getting more Germanery.
Yep.
Dmitri, we need to win this war. I need someone with a great military mind to step in and take control. You're right. How about General Hickenlooper? How about me? You can't run the war. Who'll be in charge of the country while you're gone? Obviously, my German wife and a homeless wizard. Duh. Nicholas declared himself commander-in-chief and went to the front lines.
Not good. And the thing is, Nicholas, his position was still mostly ceremonial, even as commander-in-chief, but he still wanted to go out there to the front lines, leaving behind his capital and his government to, fall apart.
Leaving his German wife in charge while they were fighting the Germans.
Yeah.
It wasn't a good look. And because Alexander was so close to Rasputin, people believed that he was actually calling the shots and secretly destroying Russia, and maybe even boinking her. An even worser look. At this point, a bunch of nobles just
I mean, we talked last time about the sort of malicious influence of Rasputin, which probably was not as major as people imagined it was, but he was a really reviled figure among especially a lot of the nobility of Russia, a lot of the people, anyone who read the tabloids, right? I mean, he was sort of a strangely appealing figure to some, but at this point, many people hated him. Any popularity he may have once had. And like I said last time, he was already a pretty repulsive figure to many, had disappeared, as Russia was in a much worse place. Many people blamed his sort of malicious influence, the Tsar's wife, so people were not happy with the situation.
couldn't take it anymore. Rasputin is destroying the country. We have to break his magic spell over the Tsar. But how? He's magic. Dude. Very cool. Hey, it's Rasputin. The sexy party is running a little late, but in the meantime, why don't you try one of these totally not poisoned cakes? Dude, why'd you say it like that? He's totally gonna know they're poisoned now. Shut up. I said they're not poisoned. Dude, he just ate so much poison. How is he still alive? It must be the magic. Go with plan B.
Right.
Is he dead?
Oh my god.
Boris, I told you he was the Antichrist and you didn't believe me.
So the actual assassination of Rasputin, I mean, we do have an account from one of the individuals responsible. However, this was probably greatly embellished. There is some stuff about him eating poison and being fine. We know he died from bullet wounds, right? So in the end, he was shot. Like a lot of things about Rasputin, this moment is very much mythologized. It's probably not as grand as it was described, but, he was killed. End of story.
Can you shut up for 1 minute and help me roll him up? Are you sure he's dead? I don't know, but I'm supposed to be hosting a charity auction right now. Can we get this over with? Okay, now he's dead. The murder of Rasputin, just like his life, is shrouded in mystery and speculation. He probably didn't really die like that, but he also probably didn't really heal people. He probably didn't influence the Tsar as much as people thought. He probably wasn't secretly destroying the country. But what he definitely...
Yes, that is exactly right. Look, Rasputin, definitely not a good guy, but was he the one ruining the Russian government? No, he wasn't, right? We know that because after he died, everything was still bad. Rasputin wasn't the one ruining the war effort. It was still bad after he died. But it was a really bad look. It made the Tsar even more unpopular. People really did not like Rasputin. So yes, Rasputin's influence certainly not as big as, people thought it was, but it wasn't good, and having him there was not good for the Tsar's popularity.
he did do, even in his death, was ruin the Tsar's reputation. Russia's autocracy looked more outdated than ever, and the Russian people were taking notice. Come on, men. Remember what we're fighting for. No, we're out.
Yeah.
World War I left Russia broke, hungry, and exhausted. And with Nicholas acting as commander-in-chief, he was getting even more blame. For the second time, Russia was on the brink of revolution. By 1917, Russia had been fighting a war it couldn't afford for 3 years. They were running out of many things, most worryingly, food. On International Women's Day, 1917, thousands of hungry women in Petrograd were so sick of being hungry that they took to the streets. And it turns out it's not just women who experience hunger, but men too. So the next day they joined in as well. Gatherings on the streets were forbidden, but I'm not sure how you'd arrest 250,000 people. The crowds demanded an end to the war, an end to food rationing, and even an end to the Tsar's autocracy. Now, normally the troops would deal with this kind of thing, but as it turns out, soldiers get hungry too, and they were also tired of having to kill their fellow Russians so much. So entire regiments mutinied in the capital, and they joined the crowd as well.
Yeah, we talked about this last time. As long as you have the military on your side, you can probably resist any sort of revolution or rebellion. But when you lose the military, you are well and truly done for. And we see here all this kicking off from a women's march. It's interesting, you look at the French Revolution, and that march to Versailles, that all-important march to Versailles, that also began as a women's march to Versailles. Of course, more people joined in as they went, but it's interesting to see that similarity there.
trashing symbols of the Tsar and his autocratic regime. Things were escalating very quickly. Liberal politicians watching the riots in the streets had long been dissatisfied with the Tsar, since he would shut their parliament down anytime they did something he didn't like. They believed the only way to bring stability back to the streets was for Nicholas II to abdicate. The riots continued. The police fired on soldiers. Soldiers fired on soldiers. The workers re-established the Petrograd Soviet. Politicians began arresting the Tsar's ministers. He may have been an autocrat, but he just lost complete control of his capital city.
Yeah, and that's why, as an autocrat, you don't necessarily want to be away from your capital, your government, when things are already this unstable.
Talk about embarrassing. Nicholas, the troops have turned against us. The people have taken over the city. They've even cut my phone line. Hello? Hello? The phones are down. Things must be bad. I'd better go back then. Nicholas hopped on the next train back to Petrograd, but he never made it to the city. His train was met by military generals and other politicians. What's going on? Nicholas, look man, we need to talk. It's not you, it's us. Who am I kidding? No, it's definitely you. During the whole crisis in Petrograd,
Yeah, so they basically hold an intervention for Nicholas. They meet him on his way back. And these are not even necessarily the most anti-Tsar people. These are people who had some loyalty to Nicholas, may have agreed with him, believed in at least the style of government, but they basically met him there and said, hey man, it's over, okay? Your rule is over. It cannot continue like this. You have totally lost control. Nicholas didn't want to believe it at first, right? We've talked about how he was a sort of vacillating man, could be convinced of anything. For once in his life, he was actually stubborn. He couldn't believe it, but they managed to wear him down, convince him. So I guess he was convincible in the end. He agreed to abdicate, right? I mentioned this last time as well, but initially, and you see this among a lot of royals, you saw this with Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette in the French Revolution, they have this belief that, we may not be popular among the liberal city dwellers, but the peasantry loves us. We've got a massive base of support among the peasants. And there may be some truth to that sometimes, but oftentimes that is vastly over-exaggerated. Turns out, the peasants weren't too happy about being sent off to die in World War I either. They were not happy with the state of affairs. They wanted land reform, right? So Nicholas had overestimated his support, and he couldn't believe it at first when they said, it's over. He's like, what do you mean it's over? A little rebellion? I can put that down. It wasn't just that. It was done.
The liberals convinced the generals that if Nicholas abdicated, the people would calm down, and the generals were on board. They didn't have time to quell the chaos, because don't forget, they were still losing a global, all-encompassing war against the Germans. And with the military no longer on his side, Nicholas had no choice but to step down. Throughout his entire reign, he had done everything he could to keep all the power for himself. And in the end, that's exactly what left him with none. But then there was a big question. Who would replace Nicholas? Well, his son Alexei was next in line. Hey buddy, Daddy couldn't handle the complex socioeconomic problems of a giant multinational, multi-ethnic empire that's engaged in total war with all of Europe. You think you could give it a shot? Alexei just wasn't ready to be Tsar. Nicholas did have a brother, but given the state of the empire, he wasn't keen either. And so, 300 years...
Yeah, so Nicholas, when he abdicated on behalf of himself, and I believe also his son. I don't know if that was explicit or not, but he abdicated in favor of his brother, right? Camera pan to his brother, who was like, I'm not so interested. His brother basically said, I'll leave it up to the democratic government, all right? I'll leave it up to them. Obviously, they were not going to install him as Tsar, so his brother basically refuses. He's like, nah, I don't really want to be involved with this. I'm probably going to get killed or something. And so... Nicholas abdicates to his brother refuses. It's over, right? There is no more Tsar of Russia. The Romanovs are done. Their reign has ended.
Years of Romanov rule in Russia just kind of came to an end.
Yeah.
The earlier 1905 revolution hadn't changed much, but this new revolution had left Russia without a Tsar. And still, before the year was over, there would be one more revolution left to come. Nicholas's failure as commander of the armed forces was the final straw that broke the camel's back. Do you think maybe you could have done any better? Well, guess what? It's time to find out. In Rise of Kingdoms.
Oh, there we go.
Rise of Kingdoms is it.
I'll let the ad play through as I usually do. Oversimplified's video is linked down below. You can go check it out, leave him a like, show him some support for making these fantastic videos.
Or conquer the crap out of them in real-time strategic battles. Oh look, it's master tactician and handsome general, Alexander the Great. If you want my advice, the troop is the most important chess piece in a battle. In Rise of Kingdoms, each troop can be controlled. To win a battle, you need to utilize careful positioning through unique troop formations, while using terrain to your advantage. I literally won the Battle of Gaugamela with fewer troops by using superior strategy. You're wrong. Joan of Arc! That's right, noob. Listen up. I'm about to drop some knowledge. The commander's skill is way more important. Each Rise of Kingdoms commander has their own unique skill. Look at me. I've added attack and defense buffs to my troops. Whoa. I'm also able to cure my wounded soldiers. Cool.
Whoa.
And I can increase their wood gathering speed by 10%. Not as cool, but okay. In Rise of Kingdoms, the decision is yours. Now go ahead, choose your favorite real historical figure and lead your troops into real-time battle. Download Rise of Kingdoms now for free by clicking on the link in the description below. Join me and 50 million other online players and guide your civilization from a lowly clan into a great empire. Now where was I? Oh yeah, hungry woman, absolute chaos, and the end of the Tsar.
Yep.
Oh, hey guys, says here there's been a revolution, and the reign of the Tsars has ended. Oh, come on, I missed another one? Why am I even in this video? Well, it's not like you could have done anything. As long as there's a world war, you can't get back to
I like that we've got Capitalism by Karl Marx, even though Marx literally has a book called Capital. We just make up one called Capitalism.
Russia. Who wants to start a revolution? Revolution. Dang it! Despite getting rid of Nick, Russia was still at war with half of Europe. The Germans, however, had an idea. They thought that if they helped Lenin get back, he would cause trouble for the new Russian government. So they put him on a train. Destination, Petrograd.
Yep.
It was a long journey, and while Lenin was cooped up in his train, things in Russia were changing.
Yeah, the Germans essentially allowed Lenin to pass through, even though he's a Russian and Russia's at war with Germany, because they know Lenin and his buddies are going to cause a lot of chaos in Russia. And they were right, though to be fair, a lot of chaos was already happening. This event would come back later, sort of to bite Lenin. I mean, there were a lot of accusations of him being a German agent down the line, because he took this help from Germany to make his way back to Russia. So, you know, that was something that didn't necessarily work in his favor in the long term. But he did make it back, right? So I guess you could argue that was probably more important, even though he attracted this accusation of being a German agent.
Workers were taking control of their factories. Soldiers were socking it to their mean old officers. Without a czar, a big old power vacuum had opened up, and someone needed to fill it. The liberals proposed they be in charge, and they set up the provisional government. The workers, however, had already begun establishing local Soviets, largely controlled by the social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks.
You've already got this sort of dual government type situation. We've got this provisional government that's sort of liberal and moderate socialist, different levels depending on when you looked at it. But then you've got these Soviets, you know, Moscow and Petrograd Soviets in particular were quite powerful. Like they said at this point, they were majority social revolutionary and Menshevik. Right, those were the two big factions, not the Bolsheviks. They were the smallest of the big socialist factions, right? Now, the Petrograd Soviet, the Soviets generally tended to appeal to the workers and the soldiers, right? That's who their sort of base was made up. That was their constituents. Whereas the sort of government, the official government, provisional government, sort of appealed more broadly to the citizenry, I suppose.
And since neither felt like they had the power to oust the other, Russia ended up in a classic dual power conundrum. The two coexisted, with the provisional government becoming the official government, and the elected Soviets issuing orders to the workers and soldiers.
Yeah.
This power balance was delicate, and all it would take is one bold revolutionary to come along and give everyone a big-brained beatdown. Oh boy, Lenin's coming home. I can't wait for him to see all the great things we've accomplished, and I'm gonna show him my fan art. Oh look, here he comes now. Shut up, shut up! You all suck! The provisional government sucks, the Soviet sucks, even your fan art sucks! Why does he have to be so mean? In case you couldn't tell, Lenin wasn't a fan of everything that had been happening. In his April theses, he called the provisional government and the Soviets a bunch of big bourgeois bozos. And he kinda had a point. There was still a lot for the Russian people to be mad about. The provisional government hadn't got Russia out of the war, the people were still hungry, and the peasants were still hoping to get more land.
Yeah, I mean, as we'll see, I'm sure, the war was really the biggest issue. Russia was still in the war. The provisional government agreed to honor their deals with their allies, right? To honor those alliances and continue fighting. Very noble of them, but incredibly unpopular among the population, right? One of the main things people were upset about was being in the war and losing so badly. They wanted out. And the war effort's not exactly going well under the provisional government. So, especially over time, that would make them less and less popular.
Meanwhile, the Soviets hadn't done much to change things either. But even though they weren't perfect, a lot of people did like what the new government had been doing. There was progress. The secret police were disbanded, the death penalty abolished. They even planned to hold elections, meaning for the first time ever, the Russian people could choose their own government. To many, Lenin seemed like some out-of-touch weirdo. If Lenin wanted to go from whiny irrelevant zero to a hunky communist hero, he'd need to shake things up a bit. So he and the Bolsheviks came up with a hot new slogan that promised to give the people what the provisional government wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, peace, land, bread is essentially what people wanted. And you'll notice, first and foremost, is peace. That is what the people wanted the most, was peace, to be out of the war. Secondly, land, right? This refers to the issue of land distribution. You know, we talked about last time, the peasantry of Russia were in a bad situation. Not just because they were being drafted and sent off to die in the war, but even before that, serfs had been freed decades prior, but they'd been left with these big debts, and most of them not owning property, right? They weren't really thriving. And so they wanted land distribution. They wanted to own the land that they were tilling. They wanted the land to be taken from these, frankly, still feudal aristocrats and given to them, right? So that's what the land refers to. Bread, pretty simple. People were damn starving, right? Production's basically shut down. The war effort's going badly. People don't have food. They can't afford food. People want to eat, right? So this is a pretty effective slogan. And this, along with the war effort going badly, allowed the Bolsheviks to begin to gain popularity in a way that they hadn't before.
Peace. Don't like war? We'll end it. Land. You want land? We'll give it to you. Bread. Hungry? Scooby-Dooby-Doo. Lenin also called for all power to the Soviets, which meant getting rid of...
That was the other big Bolshevik slogan. All power to the Soviets. We've got this dual power situation, the provisional government and the Soviets. Get the provisional government out of here. All power to the Soviets. Pretty self-explanatory.
the provisional government and having the Soviets run the place. A communist dream. The people liked these slogans, and bit by bit, the Bolsheviks became more popular.
Yeah, exactly. The people, they liked these slogans. The Bolsheviks became more popular. I will note they were still not the most popular leftist faction, right? The social revolutionaries still had a lot of support throughout the countryside, and the Mensheviks even were still more popular, though the Bolsheviks would begin to rise into the same stratosphere as these two. And I'll point out, Lenin, he wants to take down the provisional government. He wants to essentially have another revolution, install a socialist government. Now, this idea was controversial even among a lot of socialists and communists in Russia, right? There's this theory of sort of dual revolution, right? If you're an orthodox Marxist, you believe that essentially the progression of really any country is going to be from a feudal system to a liberal bourgeois capitalist system and then to a socialist system, right? And each of these shifts, these transitions, happens with a revolution, right? And so this first revolution of 1917 was seen as the liberal bourgeois revolution, right? Russia had gone from a feudal czarist system to a liberal capitalist system. Lenin was saying, all right, let's do the next one. A lot of the more orthodox Marxists among these Russian socialists were saying, wait a minute, we need to develop industry. We need to move into our sort of capitalist industrialist era like the Western European countries have done, like Germany and France and Britain, and only then can we move into the socialist style of government, right? Now, this was a sort of orthodox Marxist way of viewing things. If you were following the letter of Karl Marx, Lenin, on the other hand, was like, we've had the liberal revolution, let's do the socialist one. He was saying, the country is mostly agricultural, we don't have an incredible amount of industry, but we can still achieve our goals right here, right now. There was sort of a split between those who were sort of more practically looking at the situation on the ground, and those who were trying to stick to Marxist orthodoxy. So it was interesting. There were splits among those socialists and communists who were present.
Some Mensheviks even began switching sides. But even though the people thought Lenin's slogans rocked, as long as the provisional government didn't mess up, they'd continue to support it. So let's check in on the provisional
Put out Trotsky there, by the way, who is going to be a very important character. He was initially not a Bolshevik, but he started to get closer and closer to the Bolsheviks and would eventually join up and become a very important Bolshevik. He was also one of the chairmen of the Petrograd Soviet. So I'm sure you can imagine Trotsky's a pretty influential guy.
government. Oh, provisional government? You've made a big mess.
Yeah.
The provisional government lasted for just 9 months, but those 9 months were chaos. The people wanted Russia out of World War I, but Minister of War Alexander Kerensky thought instead of doing that, why not do the exact opposite? If the people saw more Russian victories, they'd have to support the new government.
Yeah, this was Kerensky's idea, was that, okay, people want out of the war, but that's because it's been going so badly. What if we win? Then everything will be great. And you know what? If Russia had pushed the Germans back and started dominating, maybe people would have been happier. But of course that wasn't going to happen. Of course. Come on. That's have you seen the way the war has been going? It's essentially a stalemate. It's impossible to gain any territory. Things haven't been going well for Russia in particular. Come on, Kerensky.
And that went just about as well as you might expect.
Right.
These heavy defeats worsened the Russian economy and made the hungry people hungrier. And by now, I think you know what comes next.
Yep.
They trashed the place. More looting, more rioting, more violence. It was like the Tsar had never abdicated. Tens of thousands of armed workers took to the streets during some of the worst violence Petrograd had seen yet. And in response, Kerensky called in the troops, who opened fire on the demonstrators.
Yeah, I think this was a radicalizing moment for many people, right? So they had revolted, gotten rid of the Tsar, brought in this new liberal provisional government. Like I said, liberal, some socialists in there too, a lot of moderate socialists in particular. But now, things are still going badly. We're still hungry, the war is still going on, okay? We're gotten out into the streets, we're revolting again, and we get shot down. People are thinking, what has changed since the Tsar? Things had changed. We've covered the things that had changed. But in that moment, I think a lot of people felt that nothing fundamentally had changed. So that was a big radicalizing moment. And also, frankly, you'll see as 1917 goes on, people become more and more radicalized, looking for more and more extreme solutions. And others, a lot of people, become more and more apathetic. They go, well, we have this government, we have that government, nothing works, whatever, right? And so maybe when a time comes when we'll see the eventual Bolshevik takeover, you have some segment that are more radicalized, and a large chunk of the population who's like, whatever, I don't care, just do what you want. Look at everything we've been through, nothing's going to get better anyway, right? So, this does not bode well for the provisional government, obviously.
For now, Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders wanted to distance themselves from the violence, but the crowds marched under Bolshevik slogans, and as a result, Kerensky, now the prime minister, took the opportunity to stamp down on the Bolsheviks. Their leaders were arrested. Lenin was accused of being a German agent, and he was forced to flee to Finland in disguise. This sucks! Now I'll never get to have my revolution. Why are you wearing a dress? It's a disguise, idiot! And it makes me feel pretty. Kerensky had successfully dealt with the violence, but he just couldn't catch a break. This increasing support for more extreme forms of socialism, along with the poor handling of the war, alarmed traditional liberals and bougie business boys. To appease them, Kerensky decided to promote a military legend to Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, someone who hated the revolution, loved the death penalty, and was devoutly anti-socialist. General Kornilov.
I'm sure this will go great. We've seen all the fantastic decisions Kerensky's made so far. I'm sure he's picked just the right guy for this position.
Hey man, thanks for the promotion. That was real swell of you. Of course, with you by my side, who would dare try to overthrow me? How about me? I did not see this coming. Unfortunately,
Yeah, you see here, Kerensky has to maintain a balancing act, and he's not doing it very well, right? Obviously, he's opposed by especially the more radical socialists like the Bolsheviks. He's sort of a man of the left of center, socialist center, right? He's got allies among some of the liberals, some of the more moderate socialists. The far leftists, they don't like him, the Bolsheviks. But of course, the conservatives, they hate him, right? Anyone who's pro-Tsar, a lot of these current or former military personnel, they despise him and his government. And so he goes, all right, let's hand Kornilov a bunch of power. That's a terrible idea because he wants to overthrow this whole thing.
Fortunately for Kerensky, Kornilov hated the liberal and socialist reforms of the new government, particularly the dumb socialist soldiers' committees. The army was no place for undisciplined left-wing snowflakes. Fearing a Bolshevik takeover was imminent, Kornilov ordered his men towards Petrograd to oust the Soviet and take over. Kerensky freaked out, and he needed help. Since he knew Trotsky was finger-licking good at organizing, he and other Bolshevik leaders were released, and they, along with the Soviet, organized the defense of Petrograd. Kornilov had the power of soldiers, but the Soviet had the power of workers, and they did what workers do best. Railroad workers diverted Kornilov's men away. Telegraph workers messed with his communications. They even infiltrated his forces and encouraged the demoralized men to desert. They were also armed en masse, but in the end, no fighting was necessary because Kornilov's coup just fell apart, and Kornilov was sent straight to prison.
Yeah, so Kerensky, he's facing Kornilov. Kornilov is advancing towards him. He obviously can't turn towards the right, right? So he has to turn towards the left. Kerensky, he can't really draw from much support. He turns towards the Bolsheviks, essentially, right? The Petrograd Soviet Trotsky, right? Because who do the soldiers listen to in the city? They listen to the Soviet. We talked about how the soldiers and the workers, they were sort of the constituents of the Petrograd Soviet. Also, in particular, they had Trotsky, who was becoming clear was a pretty brilliant military mind. So Kerensky feels he has to turn to them. He releases a lot of the Bolsheviks from prison, arms them, allows them to organize. They organize the Red Guards, and they manage to prevent Kornilov's assault largely non-violently. It doesn't lead to a massive battle, largely through sabotaging the advance, a lot of sabotaging railroads, some of Kornilov's men deserting. Kornilov's whole assault falls apart, and he's arrested. But, which is good for Kerensky, right? Because that would have been it for him. However, the bad part of this for him is that he has empowered the Bolsheviks, right? Not only literally empowered them, like militarily, but he's also made them a lot more popular. This was a big turning point for the Bolsheviks, right? We've seen the Bolsheviks were already growing more popular as the war effort continued. The provisional government was on a downturn. The Bolsheviks, with their slogans and their original opposition to the war, right, Lenin had always been opposed, were getting more and more popular. The Kornilov affair, that really skyrockets them up. Right now, the Bolsheviks are seen as the saviors of the city, also of the Republic, which is sort of funny because they're going to take it down. But they're the ones who have defended everybody from this right-wing coup, essentially. Right? So the Bolsheviks are now more popular than ever, which is not what Kerensky wants to hear.
Everything was coming up Kerensky. Hey, thanks for the help, boys. Couldn't have done it without you. Now that there's no longer any threat, how about you, return all those guns I gave you? No.
Yeah. No.
Oh, no. In order to kill a rat, Kerensky had just given a gun to a bear. A Bolshevik bear. The whole affair was a huge propaganda win for them. They had defended the revolution, and their popularity skyrocketed.
Yeah, and, that graph, don't take it literally. We will see when we actually have some elections, the Bolsheviks do not win. But it is correct that the Bolsheviks were now more popular than ever, and they were particularly popular in the Soviets, right? They found themselves beginning to, if they hadn't already, fully control a lot of the Soviets, particularly in Moscow, and the all-important Petrograd Soviet.
They found themselves elected to the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets, with Trotsky even becoming chairman in Petrograd.
Exactly.
They were now in a very powerful position, almost powerful enough for Lenin to return home from Finland and finally stage his long-awaited communist revolution. The Bolsheviks began planning their takeover of the Russian government. Some got cold feet and began arguing against Lenin's armed revolution in favor of a more peaceful approach.
Yeah, there was some dissent, right? Zinoviev and Kamenev, who were two important Bolshevik leaders, they were not necessarily on board. But remember, what did we talk about last time? How would you describe the Bolsheviks? Would you describe them through ideology, through action? They're the party of Lenin. That is the number one descriptor of the Bolsheviks, the party of Lenin. Always remember that. And so, you have some of these other Bolshevik leaders, they don't agree. What happens? Well, Lenin wins out, as he always does. It's his way or the highway.
And they even wrote newspaper articles about it, which kind of gave the whole scheme away. The Bolsheviks are planning an armed revolution? I did not see this coming. Kerensky began arresting Bolsheviks, and as a result, Lenin and the boys felt they had no choice but to commence the revolution right now. Lenin was back in Petrograd, but was still in hiding, so Trotsky got the ball rolling, using his position as Soviet chairman to organize the Bolshevik militias. Now, if you were to ask Soviet artists, the revolution went something like this. As much as they would like you to think it was a glorious, violent, heroic takeover, the truth seems to be a little more underwhelming. The Bolsheviks just kind of walked into key buildings in the city.
Yeah, I mean, think about what I talked about earlier, right? There's been increasing radicalization, which is where a lot of Bolshevik support among the workers and the soldiers has been coming from. So they've got a lot of support among the military. Also, there's been an increase in apathy. A lot of people who don't see things going as they'd like, they just sort of withdraw. And so, maybe if this had happened months ago, there may have been a big groundswell of support for the liberal government among maybe the middle classes or more liberal types, but a lot of these people had sort of retreated, become more apathetic, didn't want to get involved. Additionally, the third part of this is the provisional government was incredibly unpopular, right? Particularly due to the war effort and all the issues that came along with that. There weren't many people who really wanted to stand up for the provisional government, right? So a combination of these things, the Bolsheviks, with relatively little resistance, are able to essentially stage a coup, another revolution. This is the second revolution of 1917, the October Revolution.
Took control. Bolshevik supporting sailors even brought in a huge battleship, but there wasn't really any fighting. Nobody really tried to stop them. In just one day, they took control of the city. Next, Kerensky just managed to escape before the Bolsheviks surrounded the Winter Palace, placing the provisional government under siege inside. Is it safe to come out yet? I think so. Fear my revolutionary might. Give me that. That night, Lenin came out of hiding to play a bigger role in the revolution. With him back at the helm, they had one more job to do: storm the Winter Palace and arrest the provisional government. And here comes the final showdown. The palace was defended by a force known as the Battalion of Death, who immediately gave up.
Yeah.
And just like that, Lenin had won. As far as violent, bloody revolutionary uprisings go, this wasn't really one of them. But Lenin was finally in charge of Russia.
Yeah,
He had spent his whole
relatively smooth, not necessarily a super violent revolutionary uprising. Though, of course, the violence here is going to come with the Russian Civil War. The Bolsheviks may have avoided a lot of violence, not to say there was none, but a lot, when they take over the government, when they conduct their revolution. But the violence is to come, because they're going to have to deal with a years-long, extremely brutal civil war in order to hold on to power.
uprisings go, this wasn't really one of them. But Lenin was finally in charge of Russia. He had spent his whole life dreaming of this moment. He set up the first Council of People's Commissars, his own cabinet, with him in charge. This was it, his chance to finally make his communist utopia with equality and freedoms beyond compare. Hey Lenin, before we took power, they were planning on holding elections. Shall we go ahead with those? Of course. You can't have a communist utopia without high levels of political participation. The proletariat should be free to elect who it. What? The social revolutionaries won. We lost.
This is what I was talking about earlier. The Bolsheviks do well in the revolution, don't get me wrong, but the social revolutionaries, they win the most seats, right? The social revolutionaries, they've got a good ground game, to put it in sort of modern political terms, right? They're very popular. They're more sort of an agricultural socialist party. They're very popular among the peasantry of Russia. They've got a massive, broad base of support. They win the most seats, and they've been a presence for a long time. The Bolsheviks, the Bolsheviks are sort of structured differently. They've always been this sort of centralized, small revolutionary party. Only recently have they become more popular, right? And they have become more popular, right? Like I said, they do well in this revolution, but they are not the winners, right? They do not gain the most seats.
Those don't count. Lenin claimed the elections were unfair, and the Constituent Assembly they created was counter-revolution.
You've got the cadets here, the rare surviving liberals. You've got basically a lot of socialists, and then the cadets, the few liberals who still try to participate in government.
He presented the new assembly with a motion that basically said, sign here and give up your power. And when the assembly was like, no, Lenin said, see, they're disobeying me. Proof they're counter-revolutionary. Shut it down, boys. Moderate socialists and others weren't happy when Lenin had the assembly closed by force, and when campaigners began taking to the streets, they were fired upon.
Yeah, Lenin was always one for more central control. We've seen that in how he organized the party. He really didn't like to leave things up to a vote. Whether you're talking about party affairs or, the governance of the country. It's always been his way or the highway. Like I said, he does things his way.
For Lenin, setting up a communist utopia was looking suspiciously like setting up a dictatorship. While he was implementing many of the communist policies you'd expect, he was also refusing to work with other political parties and cracking down on opposition. Hey Lenin, are you setting up a dictatorship? I'll shoot you if you are. Of course not. What a crazy theory. Anyway, I'm pleased to announce I'm setting up a secret police force to repress and kill traitors. And by traitors, I of course mean anyone not loyal to me. Owie, 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 owie. The assassination attempt made on Lenin's life in August 1918 failed, but in response, the Bolsheviks ramped up their oppression. But while all of this chaos was erupting back home, Lenin and the boys were also distracted by another problem. They were still at war with the Germans.
Yeah, the thing is, even if you don't want to be in the war is still happening. And so the Bolsheviks, they're going to have to work out how to deal with this. How do we get ourselves out of this conflict? And it's going to be difficult.
Promised to give the people peace. So Lenin made Trotsky Commissar for Foreign Affairs and sent him off to negotiate a peace deal with the Germans. The Germans offered Trotsky really harsh terms, because they were winning the war. They demanded Russia give up a butt-ton of land, something that would be devastating to the economy. Look, I know it's not great, but I think we have to accept it. Are you insane? This will ruin us. Hey Trotsky, you got a big brain. What do you think? How about no war, no peace? What's that, Mr. Trotsky, sir? It's simple. No war means we'll stop fighting the Germans, but no peace means we won't sign the peace treaty either. Then, when the Germans say we've just stopped fighting, they'll have to leave us alone or something. Trotsky, that's genius. I could kiss you. Do you want me to kiss you? Stop asking me that. Trotsky's no war, no peace plan was a huge success. Oh, wait, no, just kidding. It went exactly as you'd imagine. When the Germans saw the Russians had stopped fighting, they slammed 700,000 troops deep into Russian territory with...
Yeah, so I was never quite sure what Trotsky was up to by this, but I will describe the situation, right? So this deal is sent. It's a harsh peace deal. Lenin wants to accept it, right? Lenin can say a lot of things about him, but he definitely stuck to his ideas, right? So he said he was going to get peace. He says we should accept this deal. Everyone else is like, no shot. This deal is way too harsh. Now, of course, we know the deal they're actually going to sign eventually will be even harsher, so they'd have been better off signing right there. Trotsky, he basically says we should call the Germans bluff, right? Now, we've got, sort of this pause. We should let it run out and leave it at that. Now, like he's about to show, the Germans push into Russia, take a bunch of territory. I think Trotsky's idea, maybe someone can explain this better to me, might have been that, Germany's fighting a two-front war. Things are going pretty, not that they're going great for Britain and France, but Germany's struggling. Maybe he thought that the Germans would rather take their troops, send them to the Western Front, and see more success there. Maybe that was the idea. But of course, that's not what happens, right? Germany pushes deep into Russia, and we'll see the outcome here.
Germans saw the Russians had stopped fighting, they slammed 700,000 troops deep into Russian territory with no resistance. Now, the new peace treaty offered by the Germans was way worse, with Russia losing a huge amount of territory, population, and resources. The Bolsheviks had no choice but to accept, and Russia was humiliated. With Petrograd now in an exposed position, Lenin moved the capital to Moscow, just in case. Things really weren't going well for Lenin, and many people were extremely unhappy with the Bolshevik government and its actions.
Yeah,
Lenin,
if you dropped into Russia at this point, you probably would have thought that this government, like the others, was not going to survive. I talked about the apathy people were feeling. I think a lot of people, probably when the Bolsheviks took over, thought, the provisional government didn't survive, the Bolsheviks aren't going to survive. And at this point, people probably believed that, It seemed like this government would not last. Now, that is not going to be the case, but you could see how right then, people were thinking, yeah, we're going to have a new government sometime soon. Another revolution, probably.
Off so many people that they've united against you. We're under attack. Relax, we always expected some counter-revolutionary pushback. I think we can handle a few angry monopoly men. But Lenin, it's not just the monopoly men. Okay, who are we up against? Well, the liberals, the social revolutionaries, national separatists in Poland, Finland, and the Ukraine, independent warlords setting up chiefdoms, anarchist rebels, the Green Peasant armies, the Cossacks, the Caucasian states, the Baltic states, the British, the French, the Americans, and the Japanese. Oh, and a legion of Czechoslovakian soldiers seem to have taken over the Trans-Siberian Railway and stolen all the imperial gold reserves.
Yep.
What? How could this get any worse? Oh, and it says here your mother-in-law is coming to stay. No! A variety of anti-Bolshevik forces had united together to topple Lenin's government and...
Yeah, so this is the Russian Civil War. We've got the Reds, the Bolsheviks, and the White forces. Now, the Whites were a real mishmash, right? A lot of different groups. Largely, we're talking about sort of right-wingers, czarists, conservatives, and liberals, right? And the Bolsheviks tended to be the Bolsheviks. Now, among those sort of white forces, you see, it's a little complicated because there were also a lot of other groups fighting against the Bolsheviks, right? A lot of different socialist groups, the social revolutionaries, anarchist groups, right? You can look at Nestor Makhno in Ukraine, a lot of anarchists, different communist groups. Some of them allied with the whites, some didn't, but essentially the Bolsheviks are facing a lot of different enemies, not to mention the white forces have support from the Western powers, Britain, France, the United States. So the Bolsheviks have got a whole lot of enemies arrayed against them, right? It's sort of looking tough for them in this moment.
Russia descended into a full-blown civil war. Now, the Russian Civil War was extremely intricate and would really need its own video, but essentially, the anti-Bolshevik white movement gained control of vast, underdeveloped areas, while the Bolshevik Reds controlled the industrial heartland, using this to their advantage.
Not to mention, I should say, there's also a lot of nationalist forces at play. This is the point where a lot of countries break off from the Russian Empire, either taking advantage of the chaos of the war to do so. Some of them, Lenin signs this order that basically allows for some type of national determination, partially because it was already happening anyway. So you have a lot of countries breaking off, and some of those countries' forces join in on the war. Now, a lot of that territory, Russia or the Soviet Union, will eventually gain back, but this is a lot of chaos and warfare going in a lot of different directions in Russia and beyond, right?
Along with the surprising military genius of Trotsky and the shocking disorganization of the White Army, the fortified Red Army gradually came out on top. It was an absolutely brutal conflict, with both sides committing horrendous atrocities.
Yeah, talking millions of deaths, atrocities. In the end, the Bolsheviks win, and if we can take a look at their territory here, I mean, there's a lot of reasons you could go incredibly in-depth about this conflict. A couple of things. You can see here the Bolsheviks, they control the Russian heartland, right? They control a lot of important industry, okay? That's number one. As Oversimplified pointed out, the white forces control a lot of pretty underdeveloped territory. The Bolsheviks, remember, as we've said, they draw most of their support from the workers and the soldiers, right? Now, who's going to be most important in a war? The workers and the soldiers, right? So that's a big part of it, too. They've got the military genius of Leon Trotsky. I think a big part of it, and in fact, maybe the biggest part of it, is that the Bolsheviks are a unified force. Now, the Bolsheviks, not to say they had no allies, but like I said, it's primarily the Bolsheviks and their forces. They're extremely unified. That's Lenin's whole thing, right? He's always ran a very centralized operation. And then look at the white forces. They're extremely disorganized, extremely decentralized. There are some leading figures, like Admiral Kolchak, but they're very decentralized, right? They find it very difficult to conduct any sort of unified war effort. That's obviously a big issue when they're going up against the Bolsheviks. So I think that is a big part of why the Bolsheviks prevail in the end.
Out on top. It was an absolutely brutal conflict, with both sides committing horrendous atrocities. To maintain order at home, the Bolsheviks began the Red Terror, and the secret police would execute tens of thousands of suspected traitors. No one was safe from the violence, not even Nicholas himself. You've probably been wondering what Nicholas has been up to this whole time. Well, after his abdication, he and his family were placed under house arrest. At first, they were allowed to live in their usual luxury, but after Lenin took over, their conditions worsened. The Bolsheviks were just holding on to Nick until they could work out what to do with him, but the Civil War complicated things. The last thing they wanted was for Nick to be freed by the White armies. And so, to stop this from happening, Nicholas's Bolshevik guards decided to act.
Yep.
It's not entirely certain whether Lenin ordered it, or if the guards were acting on their own volition. But on July 17th, 1918, with White armies approaching, they woke Nicholas and his family in the middle of the night and brought them into the basement. There, a drunken squad of Bolsheviks murdered the entire family. Nicholas, the last Tsar, once one of the most powerful men alive, had met a brutal end.
Yeah, so we don't know if there was an order to do this, right? Perhaps Lenin never ordered it. This was done independently by the Bolsheviks, the local Bolsheviks in this area. Perhaps, I mean, we have found no paper trail leading this back to Lenin. Now, maybe there was a direct order and we just, don't have it anymore. Um, that could be the case. No order. There could also be some in between where there was sort of an implication from the Bolshevik higher ups that you should do away with these people without any direct order, right? The kind of thing you see this sometimes in dictatorial systems where the dictator sort of hints, I don't like this, and I don't like this person, and that person ends up dead, but there's no direct order from the dictator. It could have been something like that. We don't know, right? We essentially don't know which of these or another situation actually happened. What we do know is that the Romanovs here all ended up dead.
But after years of fighting and millions of deaths, Trotsky and his Red Army came out victorious.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that was a close one. Okay, back to creating a communist utopia. How are we doing on that? Well, the Civil War helped create a massive famine and about 5 million people starved to death. There's massive inflation and the ruble is worthless. Hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of railway track have been destroyed. Disease and epidemics have killed 3 million. The population of Moscow and Petrograd has collapsed. Life expectancy has plummeted. Sailors in Kronstadt are rebelling. People are freezing to death in their own apartments and life has been reduced to a constant search for food and shelter. Whoa.
Yeah, things are not going well. You know what I mean? You thought things weren't going... I mean, it's just been a string of bad situations for the people of the Russian Empire, right? You have to deal with World War One. That's horrible. You've got the revolution, the provisional government, things go badly. The Bolsheviks take over. Now you've had to deal with a years-long, extremely brutal civil war, right? Obviously, things have not been getting better. It's bad.
Well, this just means I'll have to work twice as hard, day and night, to save the country. Nothing will stop me, short of a couple of sudden strokes.
Uh-oh.
Get the doctor. One thing you have to keep in mind is that everything I've been talking about, the Civil War, the assassination attempt, and Lenin's struggle to maintain control at home, were all happening around the same time, and it must have been extremely stressful. Lenin began getting headaches.
Yeah, I mean, especially for a man who centralized power so much, he had an extreme amount of responsibility just on him individually, and it's clearly not good for his health.
Insomnia, and in 1922, he suffered 2 separate strokes. As the Soviet Union was officially declared under a strict one-party system, Lenin's health continued to decline, and his ability to lead the Communist Party went with it. Everybody assumed Trotsky would succeed him. He was a great speaker, he'd won the Civil War, and he had a dope-ass train.
Yeah, Trotsky is sort of the immediate successor. Everyone expects him to be the next leader after Lenin.
Last person anyone expected to take over was Stalin. Stalin wasn't a great intellectual like Lenin, or a charismatic war hero like Trotsky. He was, as one Menshevik described him, a gray blur, someone who operated in the background.
Yeah, tended to be a little more understated. All this is sort of funny to say now, because of course, Stalin becomes such a monumental figure of world history, but at this point, someone who operated in the background, someone who may not have necessarily stood out from the crowd.
Someone who you might not even notice. But it was in the background that Stalin would rise to power. Here's how it happened. After the revolution, all the Bolsheviks hoped to get a cool job in the new government. What did you get? Commissar for War. Sweet! What'd you get? Secretary. Stalin was made general secretary for the Communist Party. It wasn't what he wanted, but Stalin quickly realized that even though it wasn't fancy, it was a powerful position. As secretary, he had the power to give people jobs within the party. So he would give jobs to all of his pals, who in turn would give him their support. The more pals he gave jobs, the more power he got. The more power he got, the more pals he got.
Exactly, right? So Stalin is made general secretary. Now, it was originally intended to just sort of be an organizational position, but as Oversimplified has pointed out, Stalin uses it to give positions of power to his allies. And, he uses this to make people's careers, right? You take someone, sort of a new Bolshevik, a young Bolshevik, put them into an important decision, they're going to be loyal to you. Their whole career relies on you. So all of a sudden, not all of a sudden actually, over a period of time, a lot of the government is now staffed with Stalin loyalists.
Lenin may have been having wall-to-wall strokes, but he was still involved in the party, and he was taking notice. He wasn't a fan of Stalin abusing his position, or insulting his wife to her face.
Yeah.
Lenin knew he couldn't let Stalin take over, but by this stage, he was just too sick to fight it. Hey man, tell whoever's in charge of giving people jobs not to let that jerk Stalin become the next leader. By the way, who did I put in charge of giving people jobs? That would be Stalin, sir.
Yeah, so Lenin was not a fan of Stalin, especially in his last years. Last year in particular, he became increasingly vocal that, hey, I'm not a big fan of this Stalin guy. But in the end, it didn't matter.
Whoa. Deja vu. Lenin's last wish was to not let Stalin take over, but by the time he died, Stalin was too powerful to remove. He had his remaining opponents arrested or killed. Trotsky was banished and fled to Europe. Eventually, he would be assassinated by Soviet spies in 1940.
Yeah. With an ice pick in Mexico. So Stalin's rise to power, a big part of it is that general secretary position. Another part of it is that, when the jostling for power happens, sort of in the Lenin's last year or so, and in the aftermath of his death, Stalin is still able to gather some allies through his opposition to Trotsky, right? Trotsky's the golden boy, everyone thinks he's gonna lead, and so Stalin's able to say, hey, why don't we, us little guys, why don't we all team up and we can go against Trotsky? And these other guys, these fellow Bolshevik leaders, these Soviet leaders, they may not have liked Stalin, but they knew the biggest threat, or they thought the biggest threat was Trotsky. Well, they team up, take care of Trotsky. Turns out Stalin was by far the biggest threat, right? They had aimed in the wrong direction, essentially.
Our dear comrade Lenin has died. We should have a state funeral. No. Let's mummify him and put him on display so people can look at his dead body forever. That's gross. You're gross. Guards, kill him. Lenin had waited so long to take control in Russia, but he never got to see his communist utopia. His short time in charge was spent dealing with the destroyed Russian economy, World War I, and the Civil War. He was cruel and merciless, but he really did seem to believe communism would make Russia a better place. Stalin, on the other hand, would take...
Yeah, I mean, Lenin did a lot of brutality, right? But, and I said this earlier, he was someone who sort of stuck to his principles, and, that was the reason for a lot of his brutality, actually. But he was an ideologue, in both the bad and, I guess, the good of that I think he truly did believe something. I think Stalin mainly believed in practically growing his power, right? Stalin was not necessarily a man of political belief. He was a power broker, and that is, of course, how he operated. And, of course, he would commit brutalities of a far greater scale throughout his reign.
Take the Soviet Union down a different path. If you thought Lenin was a tyrant, well, you ain't seen nothing yet.
Yeah.
A secret police state, a rapidly militarizing superpower led by a paranoid man who deeply distrusted the West, would see the world come to the brink of nuclear annihilation. That's right, I'm talking about...
Oh.
Remember to click the link in the description below.
Alrighty. Another good video from Oversimplified. Maybe we'll do his Cold War videos sometime in the future. The Russian Revolution. A pretty complicated event, I will say, doing it oversimplified. There's certainly a lot we didn't get to cover. You could essentially dig into any moment of the Russian Revolution and have many, many sources to read through. But still, a good video, some interesting stuff. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and especially since all these oversimplified videos always get copyright claimed, I'd really appreciate it if you check out my Patreon, links down below, or channel memberships, right? You can become a channel member by hitting the join button next to the subscribe button. Both channel memberships and the Patreon will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Thank you so much for all of the support. With that, hope you guys are all having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.